Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LCK Spring Playoffs Round Number 2 overview and analysis video. We are here in the top 4. We are at the double elimination stage after that first round of LCK action. We know the 4 teams that are left. One of these teams left will be your 2024 LCK champion. Another of these teams left will be going to MSI alongside them. So these are some pretty important series. Of course, the winners of these two series today, they move on to winners finals. That's top 3 guaranteed. The losers go down into the lower bracket to fight their way to potentially keep moving forward. So a lot on the line. Nobody eliminated here today, but still some very, very interesting series to go over. If you guys are excited, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you think was going to happen in these two series? Did they live up to your expectations? Were you disappointed by the outcomes? Were you surprised by any of the games? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions on everything down below. Of course, if you want to know my thoughts and my predictions on these series, you can check out my round 1 video linked up in the iCard right now. Not only do we go over the round 1 series, which half the teams who are playing today ended up playing in, but of course also we previewed these two series. I talked about who I thought was going to be able to come out on top and why I think they're more interesting than maybe some people are giving them credit for right now. Both of these series I think were very interesting. We'll preview them in this video as well. I'll kind of talk about some of the things I said there, but if you want a more in-depth analysis on what I think will happen, you can check out that video up in the iCard. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we do in this series is we go game by game in each of the series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team is able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of each series, I'll be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will be previewing our next 2 series, of course, in this video as well. That means winners finals, as well as that 4th place matchup between the 2 teams that move down into lower bracket. So I'm excited to preview that at the end, but for the most part, today is going to be spent talking about these round 2 series. It's really, really big to be able to win this. You keep your extra life intact and you guarantee yourself top 3. So some big games coming in, and that's going to start off with our number 1 seed kicking off their playoff journey. It's the number 1 seeded Gen.G taking on the number 5 seeded Dplus KIA. Of course, DK getting over KT Rolster in round number 1. Kind of an upset, but really not really. KT's always been incredibly inconsistent. It's not like DK is some horrible team. And honestly, I think this does make for a more interesting matchup. Yes, KT was the only team to actually be able to beat Gen.G in the regular season, but DK is one of those orgs, and especially this collection of players that just plays Gen.G very tough. This has not been a blowout really at any stage throughout this year. I think DK actually has a really interesting matchup, in particular because of Canyon on Gen.G. You talk about a player who was on this organization for many years. Players like Lucid and Showmaker have been even Kellen have been practicing with him for many years, know his styles very well, and so to go up against him, they've actually been more successful than your average players at those positions, specifically Lucid. He's played some of his best games over the course of his early stage of his career against Canyon, which you wouldn't necessarily expect because Canyon has been the best jungler in the LCK, but Lucid has been excellent in terms of matchup into him, so that certainly makes this more interesting because Canyon and Chovy have just kind of run the league as a duo. Chovy was the unanimous MVP. It wasn't even remotely close. He was by far the best player in the league, but honestly, there is a bit of a circle when it comes to the best mid laners in the LCK. Chovy doesn't really dominate Showmaker. He's the one player that I think Chovy has had the most trouble beating. You know, you can sit here and talk about how, Chovy has beaten Faker pretty regularly over the past couple of years, and that's relatively accurate, but Showmaker is honestly a little bit more difficult now. His team around him isn't exactly as strong as Chovy's, and so that could definitely be a little bit of an influencing factor, but hopefully this jungle mid matchup is actually super interesting because I'm projecting it to be one of the more interesting matchups that Gen.G could possibly have over the course of this tournament. When you look at the bot lane though, Gen.G should be more consistent in terms of the 2 players there. Pays and Lehens have been very good for quite a while now, 2 straight years, not only as a duo, but individually. They're just very talented players, and even though Pays has been kind of the example of a weak side AD carry over the course of this year for Gen.G, with this team playing a lot more towards mid and jungle, and Lehens being somebody who wants to roam around the map a little bit more, create more macro impacts across the board for Gen.G. Pays has been a little bit more weak side, but Aiming and Kellen have been strong side in a lot of these games. Aiming is really the make or break player for DK in terms of whether or not they win or lose. When he plays well, they often win. When he doesn't, they often lose. He's either the best or the worst player in almost any given game, and that can be very scary if you're a DK fan because he's not exactly the most consistent player in the entire world. He is very aggressive in terms terms of his positioning, but when it works, he dominates games, and so you're hoping that potentially you could get the good version of this bot lane in a pretty important moment here. And then Keen versus Kingen, this is pretty Gen.G favored, as I talked about in that preview. This is just better for them on the top side. Keen has been one of the top 2 top laners in the LCK, and I think there's a big gap between the 2 best and everybody else in the LCK right now, even the really good ones, you know, like Kingen, who's pretty solid, not a problem, just I wouldn't say elite in the same way that Keen is. And so Gen.G on paper should theoretically be favored, but we talked about some ways for DK to actually make this series interesting, with potentially Lucid playing better against Canyon, as he has done historically over the course of this year so far, Showmaker being a really good player, and Aiming and Kellen having potential pop-off performances. I think DK is going to make this interesting, but my projection, I think, in that video was Gen.G 3-1, Gen.G 3-2. That was my spread. I think that's relatively fair. I think DK will win at least one game in this series. I would be shocked if they went down without a fight, just because of all the things we talked about. But if Gen.G loses their first playoff series, that is an absolute disaster. They didn't quite lose to DK in the regular season, even though they came close on a couple of different occasions, and so I imagine they're going to be getting over the hump here in a best of 5, but the only way to find out is to go game by game, and of course, going game by game means we get to start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Gen.G. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and that's full control. We always talk about how game 1 is very important. Maybe not the most important game in the entire series, but certainly up there for one of those important games, because establishing tempo early on in a series, just taking control, forcing the enemy team to play on the back foot already from game number 2 is really a strong start. It's one of the best mental advantages you can have in a best of 5 series like this, not only because it hurts the enemy team, but because it helps you knowing you can beat them across the board. And that's exactly what they did here. This was kind of a quote-unquote close game. They gave up some things in the mid-game, Gen.G that is, in order to keep this relatively interesting. However, it never really felt like DK was ever going to win game number 1. Gen.G really had it in control. They had a very late-game scaling comp, and they were ahead by the time they hit 20 minutes. And while DK has a very dangerous front-to-back with a potential like Renata ultimate coming out on top of a Rumble ult, which could just blow up your entire team instantly, that adding on to like Aurelion Sol plus Jax is actually very dangerous. In a front-to-back 5v5, the problem is Gen.G actually has a lot of options to pull apart that team fight. You got the Twisted Fate, you even got like the Tahm Kench that could potentially be in a side lane and create a lot more of these like split push scenarios where the Jax and the Rumble have to go answer, or the Asol has to go answer, and Gen.G can kind of just win the macro game that way, and that's exactly what they did here. So good execution on a pretty interesting draft. Player of the game in game 1 for me is going to go to Keen in the top lane. I talked about this potentially being the biggest gap in terms of these two teams, not because I think Kingen is awful. Again, I want to reiterate, I think Kingen is a pretty good player, but Keen is better than a pretty good player. He is one of the most elite top laners in the world. He's proven that over this year. He proved that over last year, and he was awesome this game on the Twisted Fate. When this champion really gets to pop off in lane, when he gets a really big lead, it is really difficult to end up dealing with him, not only because he can side lane at such an efficient rate and, you know, create all these macro plays with his ultimate, but also because he does a lot of damage. Like, he does more damage than I think people give him credit for. Point and click CC is pretty good. Like, Gold Card is just a very good ability. Just a lot of things for TF to offer that make him a very valuable champion both in and out of lane. But Keen got really far ahead, was able to really control the game in terms of how the macro was played, pulling apart, you know, DK into these 1-3-1s or these 1-4s that they didn't really want to go into because of the rest of their comp, and they ended up losing because of it. They had to give over something. They never really were able to get any towers because Gen.G controlled the map super well, and a lot of that credit to me goes to Keen. But I do want to shout out Lehens and Pays, so I think we're generally solid here. I've talked about this a lot. I really like Senna Tahm Kench. I think it's a very good bot lane, almost an underratedly good bot lane at this point. It does a very good job of just being useful, mostly because I think Tahm Kench is incredibly undervalued in the meta. It's really only played with Senna, and I understand why, because I think TK does need some resources in order to be as dangerous as he can possibly be. But one thing I would like to see potentially from some teams is TK top. I really don't see any reason not to see Tahm Kench top right now. I think it does really well into some of the more meta top laners and actually scales in a more consistent manner. Probably not something we're going to see, but I like Tahm Kench as a pick, and I think Lehens played it well. Pays was solid here, just did everything he needed to do on the Senna, capitalized on all the things that specifically the Vi and the Twisted Fate were able to set up for him. Chovy and Canyon were also fine. Canyon, kind of the sacrificial lamb in a lot of these, you know, flips, but generally it was worth it. I'm just not a huge fan of Vi as a champion. I think she doesn't do nearly the same kind of job as some of the other champions that fill a similar role do at the current moment, like Lee Sin and like Xin Zhao, that I think are just more active and proactive on the map and don't rely so much on snowballing the game out of control. But Canyon was still very good. I'm not trying to criticize the player. I just don't love Vi as a pick. But generally, I think Gen.G just played this very solid, very well. They're not the most exciting team in the entire world, but they are one of the most calculated, and they are one of the best, and we kind of saw that here. And then for DK, just kind of got picked apart. You had a strategy and you really were never able to execute on it because you never got in a position to be able to control the map and control the tempo of the game. And losing that early on in a series like this, it's never going to be an entirely ideal circumstance. Dud of the game here for me in game one is going to go to King, and the top gap was at least a little bit large here. The Rumble was never relevant in this game when you're talking about the wombo that you want to pull off with a potential Aurelion Soul ultimate into Rumble ult, or Renata ult into Rumble ult, or something of that nature, right? Setting up the opportunity to get people stuck inside that Rumble ultimate. You just were never able to get that 5v5 off, and King, and I think, really was the one who struggled because of it. He is definitely somebody I'm going to be watching out for in this series to see if he continues to be a bit of a negative. I don't think anybody else in this team was great. Kellen really never got to do anything on the Renata, was definitely taken advantage of by the Senna as this game continued to go along. Lucid definitely got out-tempoed by Canyon, even if I don't think he was really all that bad. Again, he clearly knows Canyon's tendencies, and so he avoids a lot of the aggressive plays that he goes for. And then you have Showmaker on the Aurelion Soul, your most proactive player on something that can't really be proactive in the mid game. It's just a little bit of an unfortunate situation because I understand why you would go for the draft that you went for. I just don't think it ended up working out. But it's only game number one. You don't got to freak out too much. You still have a lot of opportunities and time to get yourself back in this series, but you probably got to do it here in game number two. You certainly don't want to go down 2-0 against a team like Gen.G. There are certain series where you feel okay potentially making some reverse sweep, comments or thoughts, but against Gen.G, that is just a lot to ask. Winning 3 games in a row against this team is something nobody has done all year long. So DK, pretty important for them to win here in game number 2, but for Gen.G, if you do get that 3-0 lead, all of a sudden this series becomes a lot more interesting for you, because now you're sitting in a position where you only need to win 1 more, and you are definitely looking like the better team. So what's going to happen in game number 2? Is DK going to be able to tie things up, or is Gen.G going to take a commanding lead? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Dplus KIA. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and of course, this is pretty essential in terms of how this series has broken down up until this point. You don't want to be in a position where you're down 2-0 against Gen.G. Winning game 2 here was really the only way to stay alive further in this playoff, and they went out and did it. A really good game from their star mid laner, and a pretty well-rounded effort, I would say, overall. A really good performance coming in from their bot lane, which we will talk about, but Gen.G making some pretty uncharacteristic mistakes. I think a lot of what I want to talk about in this game does revolve around some of the things that I said in the pre-series of this, talking about how it's clear that DK knows Gen.G very well, or at the very least knows Canyon very well on the other side, and could potentially take away some of his more aggressive early game tendencies because of that. Well, that's exactly what happened in this game, and yes, you have to give a lot of credit to DK for that, but it's very interesting that this specifically happens in this team matchup, basically every single time these two teams have played over the course of this year. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game in game 2 is pretty obviously going to go to Showmaker. Awesome stuff on the Ahri. When you see one of the best players in the world play Ahri, it is almost always a treat. We've been talking about it a ton with Knight over the course of this year. He's just the best Ahri in the world. Faker always absolutely pops off. Chovy's very good at Ahri. Like, when you get a really good Ahri player playing Ahri, all of a sudden it's a lot more fun to watch. That champion becomes a lot more aggressive. Those charms become point and click, and the impact that you can have on the game on that champion becomes ridiculously high. And Showmaker is obviously one of the best mid laners in the world. Whether or not you think he's still even remotely at the level of like his peak in 2020 and 2021, he's still pretty darn close. He's one of the best players and is definitely the best player on his individual team. And when they really needed him to step up in this game number 2, he did. He is going to have to be very good in this series, I think, if DK wants to advance. So really nice game number 2 from him. Like I said, the bot lane was also very good here. Aiming and Kellen, I think, had a great game. Kellen in particular, I think, was really good on Nami. Oftentimes that champion can get a little bit, I guess you could say, overshadowed, but Nami really doesn't do all that much outside of enabling Lucian. Really, the pick is there to make your AD carry stronger, but Nami has a lot of tools to be kind of a game breaker in some of these fights as well. Of course, landing bubbles is super important, and that ultimate can be used at the right time to really create some really advantageous situations. I think DK knew that they wanted to take a lot of fights in very closed-off spaces because they wanted to try and make sure that the Draven didn't have a lot of space. That kind of works against them when it comes to the Rumble, but we'll talk about how that didn't end up mattering in this game. But Kellen, I think, had a really good one here in game number 2. Aiming was also really solid, didn't really make any errors on the Lucian. When you're playing that matchup, you need to be careful, because if Draven starts to get the ball rolling, you're just never going to be able to catch up on a champion that doesn't have the range to be able to deal with him like Lucian. So really well played by Aiming. Sometimes he overextends and puts himself in bad positions, as we all know, but this game was pretty good. And, Kingen and Lucid were also really solid. Kingen was definitely the better top laner here in game 2. Really nice to see after he got kind of destroyed in game number 1. And Lucid was very consistent. A lot of the engages he went for to set up plays for the Ahri or the Lucian position ended up working out for the team, and he had a lot of the objective prio in this game. So generally, very good game from DK. Very well executed, and, I don't know if they win this if they don't have a superstar in the mid lane, but it doesn't really matter what happens if they don't, because they do. They have a superstar in the mid lane. Showmaker is that good. And then for Gen.G on the other side, very poor performance from a couple of very key players here. Canyon kind of just got figured out. He's going to get dead of the game here on the Jax. He was just really slow in the early game, didn't really have any plays to go for, and you were really hoping that you were going to be able to create a lot of early game action because your lanes are Jace, Tristana, and Draven. You're really looking to try to win this game quickly. You are looking to try and dominate the early game, and your late game insurance is quote-unquote the Jax or potentially the Tristana if she does get pretty far ahead. But Canyon was never really able to do any of that, and by the time you were hitting the mid game, this game was starting to spiral. You couldn't actually fight over any of the objectives, and it really wasn't working out for you. I don't think this was the worst game of all time or anything like that. Gen.G stayed relatively relevant because, Pays and Lehens were at least kind of interesting in fights. Draven plus Rumble is just such a high damage combo that even if they weren't playing well, they're always going to be scary to try and engage into, and Chovy is really good at Tristana, and so you do have to be worried about that as well. But DK did a great job, I think, of shutting that down early and using their mobility advantage and really their macro presence to be able to get out ahead in this series. Canyon was pretty bad. Keen obviously just got outplayed on the top side of the map, and I think you can really actively point out to a lot of mispositioning errors coming in from the Rumble in the support position. We've seen Rumble support. It's becoming a lot more common now. It's a very lane dominant pick, something that can really snowball games out of control, and obviously it's going to be useful in team fights. You're not going to have as much gold as you would generally in top lane. Obviously you're not farming, but it can still be very dangerous. That ultimate just has such high bases that you're going to be relevant in a team fight no matter what. However, if your positioning is bad, you can be taken advantage of. This isn't exactly the safest champion in the entire world, and when you have Nami bubbles landing on you super consistently, a Vi on the other side that can just ult you, or if Showmaker's playing really aggro and can hit that Rumble with a charm because he's often going to be in range of that, you don't really have the stats to be able to survive and engage like that, and this team's not really built to be able to protect him in those situations, and so you do have to kind of play on the edge of danger when you're playing something like Rumble support, and I don't think Lehens had a particularly phenomenal game in that respect in this one. But overall, it's just game number 2. You don't want to panic too much. There are worse games that you could have had in the middle of this series. It now just turns into a regular season best of 3, and Gen.G has already won 2 of those over the course of this year. Who's to say they can't win another? But DK, they had this weird mental advantage against Gen.G, and it did kind of show up here in game 2. If you can continue to take Canyon in particular off of his game, this team is going to struggle a bit in terms of early game macro, and you have the potential to be able to take advantage of that if your drafts continue to go in a positive way. So it's going to be interesting to see, but game 3, as you all know, in my opinion, the most important game of the series when it is tied at 1 apiece, because gaining that momentum, only having to win 1 of the final 2 games, it's just such a mental advantage over the enemy team. So who's going to be able to gain that? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to reassert their dominance in this series by going back up 2-1, and they have full control of where this series goes from here. Blue side's been very effective so far. We'll have to see if that continues, but Gen.G being able to get this win here to really put a lot of pressure onto DK is pretty massive. Like I talked about just a couple of seconds ago, DK, you don't really want to lose game 3. You don't really want to have to win both of the final 2 games. It's just this big mental hurdle to try and overcome. You want to be in a position where you can actually take control of the series, especially after winning game 2. But back to basics for Gen.G. I think they have realized that putting Canyon on more aggressive picks might not work in this particular series with some players on the other side that know his comfortable pathing and how he likes to play a little bit more intimately, if you will. And so let's put him on Sejuani. Let's put Chovy on Corki. Let's go for this late game scaling. We'll even draft Rumble support again. Cassante will play for these team fights. We'll play for these 5v5s. We don't need to try and do too much in the early game. We just need to make sure that the game doesn't get out of control, and then we can outplay them in these 5v5s as long as the game is neutral. Our macro is better, our decision making is better, and they were able to execute a little bit better. Now, it wasn't quite that clean in terms of the actual execution of the game. This was very close, certainly the closest game of the series up until this point. DK getting that Baron was really important in keeping this game alive for them. They just could never actually win a fight. Zeri was strong, but she wasn't strong enough. I think Aiming and Kellen had really good games. Showmaker had a couple of really good moments on the RE, very similar to what he had in game 2, but I just don't think they had enough frontline or enough real firepower to be able to get through like Sejuani and, the Rumble in the Cassante. Like, it was just too much, I think, for DK to be able to overcome, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game is going to go to Chovy on the Corki. I think there were a couple of champions you could theoretically give this to. I think Keen was really good this game on Cassante. Cassante is one of those champs where when he gets rolling, he just starts to destroy the map. And obviously, Showmaker is no stranger to K'Sante with that funny copy pasta being viral for him. But Keen was excellent in this game. I just think Chovy was the primary reason they were actually able to win fights. Scaling with Corki is not always a strategy that I'm going to endorse. I really am not a big fan of Corki in this particular meta. I think mid lane prio and pressure is so important, and you just don't really generate that with Corki. You really have to scale into the late game, even if you're really good at him, even if you're the better player. I think it can sometimes make a better player look worse, and that is kind of the example of what a champion should not be doing, of why you should not pick a champion at this level. But Chovy ends up making it work. This game goes relatively long. 31 minutes isn't crazy long, but there were late game team fights. Both of these teams had enough items to really kind of function in sort of 5v5 environments, and at that point in the game, that's where Corki starts to take over. His poke becomes immense. It's really difficult to end up approaching any sort of situations. You know, having a Corki on top of having a Rumble, on top of having a Varus, on top of having a K'Sante, you know, entry point into some of these objectives becomes infinitely more difficult, and it just puts a lot of the pressure on DK to find creative ways to do it, and they just weren't able to do that. But also, it's not like he can't take over team fights. We know a Corki can absolutely demolish one fight with one great package, which is what Chovy had in this game. So credit to him. He continues to look very good. I don't think it was clear cut in a way where it was like he's so clearly the best player in the entire world, but he was very good in this game. And again, Keen was also very vital, I think, especially as this game grew further and further along. K'Sante ends up just becoming more and more useful as these games get further into the team fight stage. He's just very difficult to kill. You know, funnily enough, you're not very tanky on the side of DK outside of the Udyr. You don't really have, you know, a lot of great frontline. Vi can, like, pseudo function is that, but she's going to be diving anyways, and so it's not really all that applicable. You don't have a ton of peel for your backline, and so if K'Sante can actually get on, like, the mid line here and really start to upset the Milio and start to upset the Ahri, then things become very difficult very fast for DK to be able to win fights with, and they don't really have ways to kill him either, especially if Ahri is not, like, ridiculously fed. It's just Zeri. You just have to hope Zeri can burst him down before he can actually do anything. That's just not really going to happen in this case. So Keen ends up being really, really effective. Canyon, I thought, was good. Really good on frontlining. Like, I think he's way better on tanks than people give him credit for. I know he's definitely more comfortable on carries, but he's been really good on tanks for basically his whole career, and I think that that has carried over here to Gen.G. Pays and Lehens were also fine. Couple of big Rumble ultimates that I think you can point out, and Pays was just generally there. Not really horrible gameplay or anything, just didn't do anything positive, really. And Gen.G was better, I would say, overall. I was going to say much better, but I don't think that that's necessarily the case. This was a close game, and I think DK did a lot of things right. Again, I think their mid and bot side actually were really good here. Aiming and Kellen, I think you can make a strong argument, have been by far the better bot lane so far in this series. Aiming will sometimes have these moments where he's way too far forward and gets caught out, and he really costs his team, but, you know, he was the primary focal point for how they wanted to draft in this game, because when you get to these, like, late game 5v5s, you don't really have another option outside of the Zeri in this team comp. You've got the Vi and you've got the Milio specifically there to set up Zeri. You're kind of hoping that maybe Ahri gets super fed, but even then, she's not going to be the biggest damage dealer. She's not going to be able to match Corki in terms of the late game damage, and so you are kind of relying on Aiming. And to their credit, to Aiming and Kellen's credit, they both played pretty well, and I think Kellen's been very, very good in this series. There just wasn't enough on this team. Kingan's going to get dead of the game in the top lane. Again, Keen was so relevant down the stretch, and I know it can be a little bit hard to play a tank in a game that goes super late. Like, your scoreline's not going to look great, your damage is not going to look great, but I don't really know what he was supposed to be doing in a lot of these fights. You know, Udyr just kind of runs in and dies. I think the champion was a bit more of a problem than the player was, but the champion was kind of useless in this game, and that's definitely more of a negative. And then Lucid, I think, could have been a little bit more clinical in terms of some of his engages. One of the problems I've had with Lucid over the course of this year is that he's really not that great of a team fighter. He's a really good smiter, and he does know how to get, like, good objective control if you do want to do fights around objectives, but when it's just straight up 5v5s in these choke point areas, he's really not mechanically dominating any of them, and he's really not going to be on the same level as someone like Canyon. He's going to be kind of a weak link in some of those late game fights, and so for DK, you've got to come up with a different strategy. You need to find a way, I think, to punish Gen.G early, because I think they are just going to beat you the later these games go, because they are a little bit more talented when it comes to their hands. You put up a good fight, and honestly, you kept this game alive for a lot longer than I expected you to, but Gen.G ends up coming out on top. But are they going to be able to end the series in 4 games, or is DK going to be able to push us to a game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Dplus KIA. They are going to take game number 4, and we are going to a game number 5 here in round number 2 in the number 1 seed's first playoff series. They could potentially be dethroned by the number 5 seed of all teams. DK has really shown up here today. This was another close game. The series has been getting closer and closer as the series has gone on, which is a really great thing to say. I don't think it was, like, ridiculous. Like, I think game 3 was probably closer than game 4 was, but this was still still a good game, I would say, from Gen.G. They didn't get completely blown out, just some pretty consequential mistakes down the stretch that I think almost cost them, and we'll talk about that as we get through. But for DK, awesome game. Really not a lot of major errors, and you can really rely on one player to really pop off when they are playing well, and you know what? That bot lane is playing well. Aiming's going to get player of the game for Game 4. You know, people complain about Lucian Nami, but I think oftentimes they're one of those picks that looks really good when it works and really bad when it loses, and so it's really hard to get a read on whether or not it's strong or not, because it is so dependent on not only the player skill, but also the game state and just generally how things go. It's so good in its own little vacuum of the thing that it does. When it does get to do that thing, when you get to skirmish all the time in the mid game, and even when you kind of get to trail into the late game and have a team around it that can really support it, Lucian can do a ridiculous amount in these fights, and aiming was excellent in this game. His positioning was nearly perfect. I truly believe that he was awesome in this, and he's been very good in this playoff run so far. I don't even think it's really all that up for debate. Aiming and Kellen have been by far the better bot lane in this series up until this point. It is really, really interesting to see that, because I would not have expected that at all going into it. It's not even just Aiming and Kellen playing super well, which they are. They're playing incredibly well in this series, but Paze and Lehens are really kind of underperforming. Paze in particular, I think, is having kind of a rough series in terms of overall general performance. Not that he has been horrid, just that he's been kind of inconsequential. He's been irrelevant to a lot of these games, and we'll kind of get to that, but aiming was excellent. I think Kellen does have to get a lot of credit for being able to enable that, and I think Kellen has been really good across the series. This was probably the game where I was more like, oh, aiming's popping off, rather than Kellen and aiming are popping off, but Kellen was still very good on the Nami. I want to give a big shout out to Lucid. This was probably his best game of the series up until this point. Very consistent early game, and some of those engages down the stretch, like he needed to be near perfect on some of those objective fights, and he was. He was really good. I think Vi is one of those champs that can sometimes be a little bit difficult to execute on in the late game because she does get blown up relatively quickly. She's just not tanky enough to be able to survive ridiculously like aggressive engages, but Lucid I think did a great job of not only surviving a lot of those engages, but actively staying on priority targets and making life a lot more difficult for the carries on the other side. So Lucid, aiming, Kellen, very good. Showmaker got his signature LeBlanc, what I would consider to be his best champion. I know a lot of people would say like Silas or, you know, Ari or something of that nature. I think LeBlanc is definitely the one I think about when I think of Showmaker, and he was excellent here in a do or die game number 4. Kingen tried. I mean, he wasn't particularly great in this game on the Rek'Sai. You really need to be able to apply pressure in lane to make that champion worth it, and he wasn't able to do that. Keen was way more useful on the Urgot. R5 Urgot's picking up a lot of steam. We've seen it in multiple different regions now, from North America to China, now here to Korea. It's very interesting to kind of see the development of Urgot actually coming into the meta, but Rek'Sai did not work out. Luckily for Kingen, the rest of this team was very good. Lucid and aiming in particular, I think, had very, very good games and really pushed DK over the top. And then for Gen.G, this bot lane's gonna be a bit of a concern. Paze has definitely been at least a little behind the 8 ball in terms of what he's been asked to do over the course of this year. I've still been pretty high on him because his role has just been very limited. It's not that he has necessarily played particularly bad. When he's been asked to fill a bigger role for this team, oftentimes he is able to do that. But this series is a little eye-opening in terms of maybe Paze has more weaknesses right now than we expected him to. He was definitely the player on the team that I was the least sure about going into this, if only because everybody else on this team has had a ridiculous year leading up into this point, and Paze has definitely been more of the odd man out in terms of resources and production in 2024, even if that's more of a role thing, like I said, than an actual production thing. But he was bad in this game. You know, I know the scoreline looks pretty good, but go watch some of these team fights. His positioning was really not good. He was either way too passive, sitting way behind his tanks and his, you know, protectors in order to try and make sure he was never in danger and not actually dealing damage because of it, or alternatively, he was too far forward and never really felt like he was just kind of, you know, biting the edge of the range. And he's really good at Zeri. He was kind of the one that made Zeri feel ridiculously overpowered last year. This was the champion that kind of made him famous and got him an MVP, if you will, last year. And so not very good to see it in a pretty pivotal game not work out really at all for him. I think you can point to a couple of other members not playing great. I think Canyon continues to not really have a major impact on this series. He was really good in game number 1, and you hope that he can continue to grow as this late game carry, but I think putting him on tanks, you know, it's going to be a different style for this team. He's going to be a lot more reliant on being able to compete with everybody on the enemy team and not just trying to out-jungle Lucid, which has always kind of been his strategy as a jungler, and I think he is good on tanks, and I think he can play for late game. I just don't think it's something that Gen.G is particularly really comfortable playing right now, and that was clear in this game. Chovy was okay, no major errors, but also wasn't like carrying the game by any means. Keen was trying his best on the Urgot. He dominated the top lane matchup. That R5 pick was actually super valuable, and he was the one that was keeping this game as close as it was. Unfortunately, because the Zeri wasn't particularly relevant down the stretch of this game, all of a sudden things became a lot more difficult for the Urgot to be the primary carry. That's just never going to work against a Lucian, a LeBlanc, even a Vi who can just disrupt a lot of the backline. There's just no way to keep Urgot from, going down early on in fights. He's just not tanky enough to be able to survive these engages. And so for Gen.G, not a horrible game. It could have gone worse. I certainly want to make that point. However, you're now going to a game number 5. Silver Scrapes is right around the corner, and you just lost game number 4. I'm not saying that this team is, in a bad position or is unlikely to win that final game, but to get to this point, I think is definitely not what they wanted. They did not want to go to 5 games against DK. I think they wanted to walk out of the series with a commanding win, like they did for most of their series in the regular season, but they're getting tested immediately, and credit to DK. They have thrown everything that they have at Gen.G in this series. Is it going to be enough to take the entire thing and cause probably the biggest upset we could have in the LCK playoffs? Or is Gen.G going to say, you had your fun, you had your time, but we are going to be moving on regardless? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to avoid disaster in going 17-1 and losing their first playoff series, which, trust me, that would have been actual disaster, and they are going to win game number 5 to move on to winners finals. For DK, obviously, they are expending their extra life here. They are moving down into the lower bracket. This was expected. I don't think anybody predicted or projected them to be able to get over the hump that is Gen.G. I don't love this draft. I think there were quite a few flaws in their game 5 draft. I think you lose a lot of agency with the things that you picked, and that's pretty much exactly what you were winning off of in the first couple of games, and so I don't love the direction that they went in. I think a couple of their players really underperformed in this particular game, but for Gen.G, they did just enough to be able to overcome it. Games 3 and 4 were very close. Game 3 in particular, very back and forth, but game 5, definitely more in their favor. Still some moments where, DK was actually able to win some skirmishes, was able to get some gold on them, but they never really had control of the map, and so things fell apart relatively easily. Let's talk about it. Player of the game and player of the series for me, maybe surprisingly, is going to go to Keen in the top lane. I know a lot of people are just going to give this to Chovy. Chovy was excellent this game on the Taliyah. We will get to him in a second, and he was really good this series. Very consistent for Gen.G. Didn't really have any sort of bad games and was very good in their good games, but when you're looking at the person that I think really dominated the most across this entire series, it was Keen. I think the top lane difference was pretty massive. Kingen just didn't quite show up and really wasn't quite as relevant, I would say, as his top lane counterpart on the other side. And this K'Sante was genuinely unkillable in this game. If you were upset or angry about game number 3 in terms of what K'Sante was offering, then you don't want to watch game number 5. That's all I'm saying. You do not need to see this one for your own mental health. Just skip it. Go to a different game. It's not worth it if you don't want to see K'Sante just being unkillable and doing a ridiculous amount of damage. He was excellent in this game. You could argue that he was only really at that point because Chovy played so well in the early game on the Taliyah to get that prio and move around the map to create advantages for him in particular, but he still had to go out there and execute on it, and the K'Sante was the most valuable champion towards the back half of this game, genuinely undealable with, which is a very funny thing to say. So Keen was excellent. He's going to get player of the series for not only this, but for the entirety of their matchup against Dplus KIA. He was excellent. Chovy was sensational, though. If you want to give him player of the series, you're not going to see a ton of pushback for me. He was really good here in game 5. Sorry, I blanked for some reason. He was really good in game 3 as well, and the Corki was probably the biggest reason that game ended up going in their direction. However, I just didn't think he was quite as impactful as Keen in terms of their losses. I think he could have been a little bit more active on the map and was often drafted a lot of scaling, and that wasn't necessarily what I wanted to see from him in this series. So I think if he had played a little bit differently, this would have been an easy choice, but whether you want to give it to Chovy or Keen, I think is really up to you. I'm giving it to Keen, but I think you could very realistically give it to Chovy as well. It was really nice to see Canyon have one of his better games of the series here on the Rel. Sometimes playing that champion can be a little bit problematic if you're not having an early lead, but luckily they did have an early lead. I think it's just like better Vi, and I know that's weird because you don't have the point and click, but your CC is so easy to execute. It's basically a point and click in terms of how late game comps are executed on it, especially if you want to target like one person in particular. And I think you want to get that early lead. You want to be able to survive when you go in and really get a lot of your stuff off, and having a Taliyah in the mid lane really helps with that because it allows the Rel to play super aggro and move around the map and be really aggressive in terms of the pathing and the objectives that they want to fight over. And I think they're just a really nice combo, and these two play off each other well. I think if you are looking for negatives, it continues to be the bot lane. Paze had maybe the worst game he played all split. In this one, this was a really bad game from Aphelios, or from Pays on the Aphelios. He was consistently getting caught out way too far forward. This champion is kind of the weakest of the hyper carries, or at least of the main hyper carries in the current meta, and Pays made him look like that. I mean, it wasn't even the damage that was particularly low. His positioning was horrible, and honestly very concerning. He actually almost got dud of the game for me here in game number 5. That's how not good he was. There was an opportunity where he was the worst player on the Rift, and he could potentially have thrown the game for his team, but luckily he kind of came through in some of those last fights, and it ended up not mattering all that much. Lehens was fine on the Lulu, but Pays had a really rough series, was definitely outplayed by aiming in all 5 games. I don't think there was a single game that you can point to Pays being definitely better than aiming, and that's really not an ideal thing to say. We're going to need to see some increase in that as the playoffs go along, but this is somebody who performed very well in the playoffs last year. You have to hope that this was just an outlier and not something that you can expect from him throughout the rest of this run. But overall, very solid series for Gen.G. I know they have some weird voodoo against them when it comes to DK, but they were able to overcome it. At least they were able to win this series, and they're able to get out of here and move on. For DK, you tried your best. You really put up a great fight against a team that is very much big favorites over you in a series like this, but it just wasn't going to be enough. Dud of the game is going to go to Kingen. The top gap in this series was just a little bit too much for me. Kingen getting a signature Aatrox, a champion that he does have a world skin on, and it just wasn't enough. Keen was so much more valuable in the back half of this game, which I guess you could expect from how this draft ended up going, but if you're going to R5 Aatrox, you got to smash that laning phase. You really do have to dominate early on, and he just wasn't really able to do that. I hate Yuumi. I think it is such a worthless pick right now in the meta. Obviously, she's gutted into oblivion, and I understand that theoretically you can still enable things like Zeri a lot better, but why are we going for late game scaling for DK when all of their success in this series has come from them establishing pressure through jungle mid early on in games, playing things like the Ahri and really moving around the map and trying to win through macro, not allowing these 5v5s to happen nearly as consistently. That's where you were losing in the other games. I think this is just a complete misunderstanding of what your team is good at in draft. I think this is a horrible draft from DK. I know on paper, this collection of 5 champions isn't necessarily awful together, but I think in terms of what DK do well, they were not set up to win this game, and they didn't win. I think Aiming and Kellen were the better bot lane, and they were given Zeri Yuumi and never really given an opportunity to have any sort of agency in this early game. Then you have Lucid on Sejuani, and he's not going to scale into Canyon. Canyon's big weakness this series has been that his early games have been predictable, but now you're giving Lucid a champion that can't really capitalize on that predictability. Showmaker's on Azir. I think that's generally fine, but Chovy's on Tali on the other side, and he's going to get the push. He's going to be able to move around the map, and especially with a more aggro jungler, this is just not a good situation for DK to play to the things that they had been winning games off of. I know I'm being pretty critical here, but I do think it ended up costing them game number 5. They were in a pretty decent state, and I think they did kind of throw it away in draft, but hopefully they aren't going to do that in the next series. They're moving down to the lower bracket. They will play the loser of the series that we talk about next. Of course, Gen.G will play the winner of the series that we talk about next, but for DK, you have to hope that they can learn from this and potentially keep going with their pretty good form. Lucid, Aiming, Kellen, these players have been playing the best league that they've played all year, and Showmaker has always been very, very good for this team. They're in good form. They're not just a team that's going to get absolutely destroyed by anybody here, I would say, in the top 4. But Gen.G holding on to that number 1 spot. They're still essentially undefeated. They lost to KT Rolster, but that was a very weird series right after Lunar New Year. I'm not trying to give excuses, but this is still the team to beat in the LCK. I know they struggled a bit more than maybe you would want here, but at the very least, the number 1 seed is going to be moving on to Winners Finals. But then moving on now to our second series of round number 2, and this one I was very interested in seeing. 2 teams that I have very similar grades on who ended with identical records in the regular season. It's the number 2 seeded T1 taking on the number 3 seeded Hanwha Live Esports. Certainly a fun matchup on paper because T1 is T1. You got to look at this team as at least kind of the favorites going into basically any series that they play in a best of 5 because they are so good, they are so experienced, and they are so comfortable playing with each other. This has been the same starting 5 for 3 years in a row. At this point, it's a 2.5, I guess, if you want to be more technical about it, but these guys have gotten very used to playing with each other. They know exactly the style that they want to go to. There are some concerns with how they have played over the course of this year, in my opinion, but they're not entirely real. This team has always played better when games matter more. They have very consistently been able to make the finals at the very least, let alone, be very relevant in a lot of those series, and so, with that bye in round number 1, they're definitely going to be considered at the very least kind of favorites going in to a series like this, but I've been pushing back on this idea that T1 is going to dominate Hanwha Life all week long. I really thought that HLE was very much on the same page in terms of T1, in terms of roster construction. Maybe you could argue that T1 has a little bit more talent, but I don't know if I would make that argument, and more specifically, very similar to what we talked about with DK going up against Gen.G, A lot of players on HLE just have this kind of voodoo magic in beating T1. You've got 3 players coming over from Gen.G who were consistently performing at their best against T1, specifically Doran in the top lane, but Peanut and Delight, I think, also do apply to that. And then Zeka in the mid lane, who notoriously was beating T1 in the World Finals in 2022. And so this is kind of a weird matchup, a really fun one in terms of the players going against the players. I think that it's going to be certainly back and forth. I would expect this to not be a particularly big blowout in either direction unless something crazy ends up happening. I will say the lanes that I would expect to be favored in T1's favor, at least confidently, would be top lane, and then I guess maybe mid lane. I wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable saying that because Zeka is a good player that can win almost any game, but Faker should be better than Zeka. You would imagine the solo lanes are in favor of T1, but you could make the argument that both jungle and bot lane are in favor of HLE in terms of what they're able to output. Viper and Delight might be, the best bot lane in the LCK in terms of how they performed in the regular season. They're certainly in the conversation for that, and Peanut has been very good, and Owners certainly struggled on the side of T1, I would say, over the course of the regular season. Another player who typically does get it together when the games matter more is Owner, so potentially we could be seeing a little bit of an increase in playstyle from Owner, but, I think HLE really has some strengths, and T1 has some strengths. My prediction for this series was T1 3-2. I expected them to be able to come out on top when I did my full bracket prediction. I picked Hanwha Life in this series, but that was because I had them losing to T1 in the lower bracket finals, in the semifinals, if you will, and I just wanted to create some parity in the bracket. I genuinely do think that T1 is the better team out of these two. However, I don't feel very confident in that. I feel closer to it being like a 60-40 than anywhere like a 75-25, like I think a lot of people would want to put it at right now. So I'm excited to get into it. I hope you guys are as well. But of course, going game by game means we get to start it off with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take the first game of this series, maybe shockingly, and go up 1-0. I'm not entirely surprised that things ended up swinging in their way in this game, but this was a very close, very back and forth game number 1. Honestly, you can really look at this as potentially not in favor of T1 because they had such a big lead at around 20-25 minutes that they just were not able to hold on to. And that's a disaster. Like, watching T1 fumble a lead is certainly not the T1 that we've come to know. It's certainly not the weakness that we expected to see them have in a series like this, but credit to HLE for having the perseverance to be able to come back here in game number 1. They basically never had a gold lead after 20 minutes until their final fights around 34-35 minutes into the game. And so big ups to them. I think they played those fights expertly and were able to get their small advantages in that regard. But for T1, you're probably going to look back at this and say that you wish you won it. And honestly, you're probably going to feel bad about this, but you showed a lot of good things in this game, and I think there's a lot of confident problems to come away from this game with, so we'll talk about that. For HLE, player of the game, no brainer. This one's going to Doran in the top lane. He owns Zeus. I don't really know what else to tell you. Like, I don't necessarily believe that one player just beats another player every single time, but if there was a matchup that made me think that, it's Doran versus Zeus. Doran's having the weakest year he's had in quite a while, in my opinion. For HLE, consistently losing in lane, really kind of being the weak link of Hanwha Life, and Zeus was awesome this year. Was my first team all-pro top laner, in my opinion, the best top laner in the LCK at the current moment, and you get a series like this, you're like, Zeus should be better, but Doran just has that mental edge. I don't know if it's just the confidence that Zeus goes into the series with, or if there are some micro decisions that Zeus makes that Doran just has like clocked and he knows how to play against. I don't really know what the reason is, but every single time these two go head-to-head, Doran plays some of the best League he's played in his entire life, and so credit to him. He was awesome on the Rek'Sai. R5 Rek'Sai is actually very strong in this particular matchup. I think, Twisted Fate is just very versatile, and he's going to be fine in this matchup, and Zeus did do a lot of damage, but Doran was so relevant in these late game fights, and honestly was the one to kind of pull back a lot of the aggression for them, being able to jump on and take out Gumayushi in the back half of some of these fights in the late game. Just really good stuff. His positioning was very good, and his aggressiveness level, I think, was really good, to kind of summarize it in a word, if you will. But everybody else on Hanwha Life was also pretty solid in these fights. Zeka is just, he's so controlled, he's so consistent when it comes to playing, Azir in particular in late game team fights. I know he gets shit for not playing, like melee assassins, it's all Zeka plays. It's just not real. Like, I understand the idea that, he can only play aggressively, and I agree with that. He really is the kind of player that really does want to be pushing forward, that wants to be a little bit more aggressive in terms of how he approaches fights, but he can do that on Azir. He can do that at on these kinds of champions. He's always been good at Azir. Go watch that Worlds run from 2022. He played a ton of Azir. I think it was his most played champion at the tournament. If it wasn't that, it was Akali, but I mean, Azir was certainly top 2. It wasn't even really close. Viper was very good in this game. On the Senna, I think Delight had a couple of good engages on the Nautilus, even if I don't think he was perfect in this game, and Peanut definitely did a better job of controlling the map in the back half of this game than Owner did, who kind of let a lot of advantages slip through his fingers, but overall, this was a team effort from HLE to get back in, and Doran was spearheading that effort. Really good performance from him. And then for T1, you gotta feel bad to let this game slip through your fingers. Again, you're playing Corki Jinx and you lost in the late game, like you had a lead going into the late game and you threw that. Not really a good sign, not really a good thing to see. Dud of the game is gonna go to Gumayushi in the bot lane. His positioning in this game, number 1, was really poor, and honestly, it kind of surprised me. One of the things I praised Guma for is the fact that he doesn't really have horrible games. He just kind of is sometimes not as relevant as some of his other teammates, but he's not really running it down ever. This felt very poor in the back half of this. He was allowing the engagers like Rek'Sai and like Xin Zhao to be able to get on him a lot more consistently than perhaps you would want. And the Jinx, who's supposed to be this big late game hyper carry, was not really being all that effective in that role. I do want to credit Faker, who was very good in this game. He tried his best to win it for his team on the Corki, but there just wasn't enough firepower. Zeus didn't really do much in the side lane. Like, he wasn't able to pull apart HLE, I think, in the way that he would have wanted to. In this game, Owner was certainly not consistent at all on the rel. Some of the engages were really good, and then by the time you hit the late game, he was constantly out of position, and Keria played Thresh, who I think is a pretty weak champion, all things considered, on this patch. T1 had a couple of things going for them. Again, their early game was pretty solid, getting the Corki, getting the Twisted Fate into okay positions. They just couldn't actually do anything with that, and again, I think some underperformances in terms of how this team played team fights in the back half really led to them losing, which is very out of character. This has been an incredibly consistent team in terms of how they've played the late game. Typically speaking, the formula, the strategy, if you will, for T1 is game is relatively close. One team fight happens at 25 minutes that they destroy, and then they end the game, and it's just over like that in a blink of an eye. And that's not what happened here. HLE was able to delay long enough to be able to just kind of get everything they wanted on the map, and they were able to close the game out because of it. Really good stuff from them, but it's just game number 1. You don't want to lose game 2 if you're T1. We talked about it earlier, but especially in this series, going down 0-2 against a team like Hanwha Life that has such ridiculous upside on a game-to-game basis with players like Zeka and Viper is certainly not the circumstance you want to find yourself in. Hopefully T1 can bounce back here and win game 2 and tie up this series, but HLE wants to get that 2-0 lead. They want to assert their dominance. They want to say, we should have been favorites in this series before this series took place. We beat T1 the last time we played in the regular season, and you have to start taking us seriously now. So which of those things is going to happen? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up 2-0 in this series, and full control has gone the way of HLE. This was an interesting game, kind of a slow one, very typical LCK, very neutral for a while until one big fight ends up breaking the game wide open, and HLE just dominate from there. It really is kind of the traditional LCK experience, except it shouldn't be happening to T1. This is not particularly normal for how these guys play their games. You would think that, you know, a team that maybe struggles a bit more with the mechanical aspect of the game, sometimes doesn't always know how to dominate 1v1 matchups. You know, they're usually a little bit more passive in the early game, but then if they are able to get those leads, their mid to late game is exceptional. It's what's put them over the top. It's what they've been the best at over the past few years, is their macro. And not in this series. They've really been throwing a lot of games and putting themselves in worse positions in the later half, which I think is definitely concerning. I'll get to why that's concerning when we get to the T1 section here, but player of the game is going to go to Delight in the support position. There's just nothing else to say. There are some players who are born to be in big moments. Delight was born to play in big games. There's nothing else to say about him at this point. Every single time Delight is in a game that really matters, whether it was on Gen.G last year or HLE this year, his level goes up by like 5 tiers. He's already a really good player, but he becomes the single best support in the entire world in a best of 5, in a playoff series, at Worlds, in these moments where they really need him. He is essential. He has been excellent for Hanwha Life in this run so far. Of course, he destroyed the Guangdong Freaks. He absolutely eviscerated them in games 2 and 3. And here's a game 2 where he, once again, was everywhere on the map, constantly making plays, making the Senna unplayable in terms of how she was able to move around. Corki couldn't do anything. Lee Sin was even having trouble trying to keep up with the Nautilus, just constantly putting thorns in his side. It just was a great game from Delight. He was constantly landing hooks on priority targets in those late game team fights around objectives. And eventually the game was just over because Delight was constantly making play after play after play. This dude is legit a superstar in terms of what he offers in the playoffs. Maybe he's not perfect in every single game in the regular season, although he was really good this split, but if you're going up from what Viper and Delight were in the regular season, which is arguably the best bot lane in the LCK, well, now this might be the best bot lane in the world when Delight is playing like that. That really is kind of the ceiling, and Viper certainly followed up on that. The damage that you can output on Zeri is genuinely ridiculous when you are this far ahead, and so credit to the bot lane. They are mega gapping Gumayusi and Keria. It has not even been remotely close in the 2v2 in the bot lane in this series. Again, credit to Doran. He continues to just kind of be better than Zeus in these games. I don't know what magic Doran has to kind of just make this work, but his Jax was excellent here. Peanut is also such a clutch performer in these big moments, at least domestically. I know some people are going to talk about Worlds and how he's not necessarily performed perfectly at those tournaments. I do think that his negative games have been kind of blown a bit out of proportion, but I do think I can understand where they are coming from in terms of the nervousness. But at least in terms of the LCK playoffs, he has been a super consistent performer, and man, he's also a player who just kind of has Owner's number, doesn't he? He played the Sejuani here, was able to just completely out teamfight and really take Lee Sin out of this game, and we'll talk about Owner. He made some critical errors, I would say, in the team fighting stage in the back half, but he also wasn't aggressive enough in the early game, and so Peanut was kind of allowed to do whatever he wanted, and Zeka, some way, somehow, was the least important member of the team in this game. If that's going to be the conversation, if Zeka is the one that we're talking about last for Hanwha Life, they're going to win Worlds. Like, that's the kind of upside that a team like that has, and so credit to Hanwha Life. They played excellent here, especially the bot lane. And then for T1, this bot lane is really starting to concern me. Gumayushi's going to get dead of the game for the second game in a row. Positioning on Senna was awful. I don't know what's going on with him. He is usually pretty good in this regard at not making major mistakes, not running into major issues, but he has been not good in this series. There's not even really another way for me to say it. He has not been good through the first two games. Keria pulling out the Scion support. I know it's Keria, and you can kind of just allow him to play whatever he wants, but this is not a good pick. This is not something I would expect to ever really be viable into Zeri and Nautilus. You're looking for frontline, I get it, because you want to pick TF top and you still want to be relevant if they want to force a 5v5. You want to have some sort of frontliner, but Scion's just not going to accomplish that job nearly as well as you think he's going to, especially because there's just simply no way that he's able to out-prioritize the Nautilus on the other side of this matchup, who's just everywhere on the map. Like, Delight was creating so much havoc, and Keria was kind of just stuck babysitting Gumayusi for a lot of this game. But that being said, bot lane needs to be better. This has been a very good bot lane. Arguably, they were the other one that you would consider the best bot lane in the LCK in the regular season, and it's just not lived up to that even remotely here so far in the playoffs. Owner also had an absolute stinker of a game, in my opinion, was really rough in terms of some of the late game fights. I understand that Lee Sin's not always going to be the most proactive when these games go 39 minutes, but you gotta see more in the early game. That's something that he has struggled at all year long. He's relied a ton on his laners winning for him, and then just kind of making the right play, like being at the objective and not necessarily creating for his team. That can be fine when your laners are winning, but when you're on Lee Sin and you've got a Corki and a Senna, you need to be the one creating a lot of the action for the team, and I don't think he did enough of that. And then in the late game, he was too aggressive, and oftentimes he was trading his life for one kill. These kicks were not necessarily relevant in these games, and his positioning did cost them in a couple of key exchanges, and so you don't really love how T1's playing. Faker was irrelevant because he played Corki and never really got to scale, and Zeus was worse than Doran, as he has been in both of the first two games. It is concerning now. You're going to a game 3 down 0-2 against a Hanwha Life team that is one of the most talented in the entire world. You've got to win 3 games in a row against them now, and they already beat you in the regular season the last time these two teams played. This is not exactly the biggest confidence builder for them, but for Hanwha Life, you're in such a commanding position. If you walk out of this with the sweep over T1, talk about like feeling good about that. I know that there are obviously some outside factors that we'll talk about in game number 3, but that would still be major for this team to move on to winners final. So are they going to be able to close it out in game 3, or are T1 going to be able to at the very least keep this series alive for one more game? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 3 and get your brooms out. It is a clean sweep for Hanwha Life on red side. I did not see this coming, even if all of the distractions, all of the outside world things happened, which we'll get into in just a second, because I do want to explain what I mean by that. I wanted to save this for the end of the series because of hindsight, but even with everything going on, I did not expect this to be a 3-0. This is shocking to me. Truly a real big endorsement testament of just how good HLE is, that even if T1's not on their best game for a series like this, even if a couple of their players are underperforming in a series like this, they are good enough to take T1 off of their game to the point where they're making major mistakes, where they're creating really big advantages for themselves, and they're able to end this series without dropping a single game. It's ridiculously impressive, and you really do have to be on the lookout for a team like Hanwha Life to go the entire way. As much as we've been talking about Gen.G and T1 being the inevitable fated final two in the playoffs, how can you sit here and say that Hanwha Life couldn't be a team in the top two, couldn't be a team that wins the LCK? This is the kind of LCK winning performance that I think we wanted to see out of HLE in a series like this. We will quickly talk about the off the rift stuff. T1 did talk in a press conference after the series and stated essentially that a lot of these attacks on their internet, the doxing, the DDoSing attacks that have been going on the last couple of weeks, the last month or so on them, have been persistent, and they've not been able to play solo queue really at all over the past 2 weeks, and that is obviously unfortunate, and I'm sure it did affect their form in some way, shape, or form. I'm not trying to say that I take this as some sort of excuse, because I don't take this as some sort of excuse. The organization of T1, regardless of the fans, have earned the benefit of the doubt in terms of not complaining about things, in terms of not saying that, oh, we lost because of this and this. I mean, they've been pretty upstanding when they lose, and so I don't really see any reason for this to be taken as some sort of excuse. It sucks that they are going through this, and hopefully it can get resolved in some way, shape, or form moving forward into the playoffs. However, I don't think that explains the entirety of how this series ended up going down, because again, like I said earlier, a lot of the things T1 struggled at in this series were things that they were notoriously good at for years, that these players are notoriously good at. Maybe it affected their mental going into the series, but I don't think it was the lack of game time that really kind of rusted them in the back half of this. I think it was mostly just bad decisions coming in from this team, which we will get into. Player of the game is going to go to Peanut for me. Not quite player of the series, but he is going to get player of the game for me in Game 3. I thought he was incredible here on the Xin Zhao. We've been seeing a lot of teams move towards tanks in the jungle as playoffs have continued to go along in most regions. Maokai Sejuani, they just give you some more consistency when it comes to securing objectives in the late game, and I think teams do prioritize that, especially with a lot of shove and, push kind of prioritized, I guess is the word, in the mid lane right now. Things like Talia, Tristana, really high priority in basically every series that has been played. It's nice to see Peanut pick up something like the Xin Zhao that has honestly fallen a bit in terms of the priority and actually still perform on it at a ridiculously high level. Great game from him. He was everywhere on the map, constantly creating action. I know Broadcast gave player of the game to someone else, but I think Peanut was the best player in game number 3 here, and I think they won because of his activity. But player of the series is going to go to the player that Broadcast gave it to. It's going to go to Delight. That's the second series in a row that Delight is going to get player of the series in. Both of them 3-0 sweeps, mind you, and he's got 4 player of the games on Broadcast through 6 playoff games. It's just ridiculous the level that this guy plays at when he's able to play from ahead, and in these big clutch moments. He is clutch. That is the word you have to use to describe Delight, which is very funny, coming up on a bad team for so many years, finally getting an opportunity to prove that he can do it in the playoffs. And what does he do? He becomes a monster in the playoffs. He's excellent in these kinds of performances. Nautilus is just such a difficult champion to deal with if the team is ahead, and especially if the Nautilus player is very good and very active on the map, because there's really not a lot of ways to get him off of your carry if he is able to consistently get on the back line or even disrupt the front line in this case, because their front line is like Jax and Rek'Sai, and so you can upset the front line very easily. There are a lot of targets for Nautilus hooks in this game, and he was very active with them. Viper was also excellent in this series. Maybe not quite like a star, but certainly significantly better than Gumayushi, and he capitalized on Delight's playmaking ability, I guess you could say, very well in this series. Certainly not trying to take anything away from him. He was targeted a lot in this game, and it still didn't matter. He was still relevant in a lot of those fights. Zeka probably had his best game of the series here in game number 3, was everywhere on the map, consistently was being aggressive. He was more of the stable presence on Azir in the first couple of games. He finally got to play Talia and got to move around and be proactive, and I think that really made Peanut a lot better in this game. And then Dorian just mega gapped Zeus in all 3 of these games. Again, it feels like a curse. I really think the only way to say it is either Zeus has some sort of mental block where he's just like actively in his own head when he plays against Dorian, or alternatively, like I said before, maybe Zeus has some like micro movements or ways that he plays laning phase that Dorian has just clocked, that he's just spotted out, that he's like, okay, I know Zeus is going to prioritize doing this and this and this, and so I can do this and I'm going to be able to beat him in that way. It's just crazy how consistently Dorian is able to beat Zeus in lane, no matter what the champions are, and no matter how well they've been playing leading into the series. It's very, very interesting, but HLE really earned this win. They move on to winners finals now. They have yet to drop a game in the playoffs. They're on like full momentum streak here, 6-0 in the playoffs. And, Gen.G better watch out. This is a team that can really do something. And then for T1, definitely disappointing to see them drop down into lower bracket. But again, with, the fact that they haven't been able to play solo queue, the fact that Hanwha Life is a very good, like a world-class team, not just a good team, like genuinely one of the best in the world. It's not entirely awful that they lost this. You just hope that they can rebound going into next weekend. Dud of the game is going to go to KIA, but really, dud of the series is the bot lane. I don't give dud of the series in these playoff series, but Guma and KIA got mega gapped in this series. It was not close. Delight was excellent, and Viper was very good as well. Guma and KIA were bad, like not just below average, not just a negative for the team. They were actively bad, like actively solo losing games. They didn't solo lose this one, but they came pretty darn close to just being entirely irrelevant. KIA was awful on the Rumble, consistently getting caught out. He was the target for a lot of Nautilus hooks in the mid game and would just die every single time he got hit. Guma's positioning the entirety of this series was horrible, was consistently either way too far forward or way too far behind the rest of his team, and it really cost them, I guess I should say. And then Faker honestly probably had his worst game of the series here on the Ahri, one of his signature picks, honestly the champion that I think a lot of people most associate with him. Zeka just outplayed him, got the push in the mid lane, and did the roaming thing that you want to get out of Ahri just better on Talia. And so now you're sitting here, Owner has some gold, Zeus has some gold, but like Jax, Rek'Sai are not going to carry you against a super fed Xin Zhao and a Varus and a Nautilus and a Talia with gold and an Aatrox with gold. It's just going to be really hard to win this game, and T1 ends up falling for it. I think this was their weakest game of the entire series, and there are real problems that this team has to fix. First of all, of course, this bot lane simply has to be better, but the macro in the late game has to be better. Them giving over leads at 25, 30 minutes into the game, that is very unlike T1, and that I need to see adjusted, because if that's going to be a trend, they might not even beat Dplus KIA. Like, that could be a bit of a problem in a series against a team like that, who does press their advantages relatively well. So, I'm not going to freak out too much for T1 right now. They could go on some big lower bracket run, win the next two series, make the finals, and then win the finals. And, that would be pretty T1 of them to do, and you could maybe expect that to happen. But at least for now, there is real reason to be concerned with how poorly they quite frankly played in this series. And then for HLE, awesome stuff. You couldn't be more excited about this team right now. If they win the LCK, that's going to be so interesting. This winners final series that we're going to preview in just a second is going to be very interesting, and I'm just very interested to see what direction it ends up going in. But now that we've wrapped up our round 2 analysis, it's time to give a preview for the two series that are coming up, both lower bracket round number 2 and, of course, winners finals. And that's the one we're going to be kicking off with, because that's going to be the series that happens first, earlier on, which is kind of weird. But in our winners finals, of course, we have the winners from the two series. Today, it's the number 1 seeded Gen.G taking on the number 3 seeded Hanwha Life Esports. Really am excited for this matchup. I think whoever ends up coming out on top is going to earn it, and this could be an early preview of who ends up winning the LCK. I'm not saying that these are definitely the two best teams in the LCK, but Hanwha Life very clearly handled T1, and it's going to take some adjustments for them to get back to the part that they were at most recently, and so we really could be looking at the two best teams in the LCK going head-to-head here. Now, Gen.G did dominate the regular season meetings between these two teams, as you can see from the numbers in the middle, 4-0, 4 wins, 0 losses across the two series, 2 2-0s for Gen.G in the regular season. Certainly not ideal if you are an HLE fan in terms of expectations. However, there are some reasons to like this team potentially more than you would just on the surface. So obviously, a lot of the momentum and confidence that they probably have after 2 dominant 3-0s is going to play into that. Beating KDF, beating T1, 2 really good teams, or at least a mediocre team and a really good team in T1 to get here. That's definitely going to give them some confidence. But look at up and down the board. Like, they're not exactly outclassed in a couple of these lanes. And I really think there's one lane in particular that could be very in favor of HLE if things were to stay the way that they have been in the playoffs so far. So let's talk about it. First of all, what you're seeing on the screen very quickly, every player in the game and in the series here with the 3 most played champions from them in the regular season with their win-loss record. Of course, any numbers listed next to those players are going to indicate where I put them in my personal all-pros. You can see Chovy listed as an MVP, but Canyon, first team, Keen, second team, etc. You get what the numbers mean at this point. We've done this in every video. You can see the records for both teams, and then, of course, the colors in the middle, the white and the kind of off-gray, black, if you will, in this game, for example. That's kind of a percentile graph for how confident I feel that each team is going to be able to win. As you can see, there's a little bit more white than there is that gray here for HLE, and so I think Gen.G is the favorite in this series, and I think they should be. I think even with them struggling a bit more in round number 2, they are the better team, and they've done really well to dispatch HLE over the course of this year. And oftentimes, I think matchups are a lot more matchup-oriented, a lot more player-to-player-oriented than they are just one, like, what team is more talented than the other. We've seen that pretty consistently, historically, in not only the LCK, but every region in League of Legends. And so I would expect Gen.G to at least be favorites going into this. But like I said, there is one lane that I think HLE could take advantage of to kind of really succeed, and it's something that I think really could be possible for them, and that's bot lane. Viper and Delight have been exceptional to me, clearly the best bot lane in the LCK at the current moment. And if that's going to be the case, if you're getting the best AD carry and the best support in the league in this series, well, things become a lot more interesting. Because, yeah, would I take Chovy over Zeka? I love Zeka, but yes, Chovy's the best player in the league. Would I take Canyon over Peanut? Right now, in current form, yes, I probably would. Canyon's been amazing, sensational, especially when these two teams have played. Would I take Keen over Doran? Almost certainly. Doran doesn't have any magic powers going into Keen in the same way that he does going into Zeus. And so, you know, the top side of the map feels very clearly in favor of Gen.G when it comes to the talent level and how these two teams end up shaking out. But I think bot lane could be an area where HLE ends up actually being in a really good spot. If Delight is as active as he has been in the recent series, then I think we're going to be looking at a much closer series than people might intend here. Now, Hanwha Life is ridiculously hot. They're white hot going into this series, so I do think there are going to be a lot of people out there that are maybe expecting them to be a lot more competitive, especially because they took down T1. Circumstances notwithstanding, it's not easy to 3-0 a team like T1, and so kind of a lot of weight on their shoulders now. They have those big expectations from everybody going into this series, and so they're going to need to try and live up to that. I think they can. I think this is going to be interesting, but when you talk about the top side of the map, this has to be in favor of Gen.G. Keen simply has to be considered better than Doran. Even though Doran just beat a player that I think is better than Keen, I think the weird voodoo aside, Keen should be the better top laner in this series, and he was excellent in their round 2 matchup. Canyon, I think, should be able to rebound relatively well. Canyon's always played very well into Peanut in particular. You know, there are just some matchups in the LCK that go in favor of some specific players, and Canyon into Peanut is one of those that I think has been very Canyon favored across his entire career. And then Chovy into Zeka. You know, I love Zeka, and I do think he could make some things interesting here, especially because he's kind of grown into this more consistent mid laner for the team, but Chovy is Chovy. He was the unanimous MVP for a reason. It's going to be almost impossible for me to pick anybody over him in terms of the laning matchup. The top side of the map is very Gen.G favored, but again, if Viper and Delight can really take over and be the strongest players in the series, especially with Pays and Lehens really not playing well at all in that round 2 series. Lehens, I guess, was generally fine on the Enchantress, but Pays had a really rough series. If he can get taken advantage of in a similar way to what happened to Gumayushi in the series we just talked about with Hanwha Life, then I actually do think that HLE could have a pretty interesting shot to win this series. If Delight's the best player, if Viper is the best player, if they're the ones that are running the game, then HLE is going to win. But that is kind of really the only avenue I see for HLE, at least in a consistent manner. I would expect topside to be Gen.G favored, and I would expect them to win this series. As you can see, I have them at about 60% confidence. Maybe you could put this higher because they did do very well in this series in the regular season. So my prediction is going to be Gen.G 3-2, Gen.G 3-1 will be my spread. I do think it should be Gen.G favored, and I think it's closer to them being able to confidently win the series than it is to HLE being like favorites going into it. But if HLE wins, I'm not going to be entirely surprised. They do have a lot of firepower on this team. I just don't think it's enough to overcome a team that was basically untouchable in the regular season. And then moving on to our lower bracket series, this is going to determine the team that will take on the loser of the series we just talked about in the semifinals to see if they can make it into the finals. They both have expended their extra lives. It's, of course, the number 2 seeded T1 taking on the number 5 seeded Dplus KIA. And I think this one's a little bit less interesting to talk about. Not only are these two teams in definitely a state of flux, but it's kind of weird. I think they're in flux for different reasons, and I think there is a bit of a talent gap between these two. As I've talked about a lot over the course of this year, I see the LCK much more as a big 3 rather than a big 4 or a big 5 or anything close to that. And as well as DK has played in this playoff run, I'm just not sure if they're going to have the firepower to be able to keep up with a team like T1. As you can see, they weren't able to do that in the regular season. 2-2-0s in favor of T1, as they did with a lot of teams that they ended up facing, but DK, I think, has been in better form as of late. A couple players in particular, I think, have been playing better in the playoffs than they did in the regular season, which I think is encouraging, but we can go position by position talking about where I think there are advantages and disadvantages. Spoiler alert, I think even the kind of disadvantages for T1 probably end up coming out on top in terms of your expected outcome of these matchups, so we'll talk about it here. Zeus versus Kingen. As much as I'd love to try and say that Zeus struggling in that first series is something I would expect to happen more often, I don't expect it to happen more often. Kingen really struggled struggled in their round 2 series even when his team was winning, even in good positions. He was actively losing games for this team, and so you're not really super enthused about that. And Zeus, I think, was not very good in that series against Doran, but again, there's some voodoo curse on it, and so I imagine Zeus is going to be pretty heavily favored in terms of the top lane matchup here. I would expect him to be significantly better than Kingen on the other side here. And then when you look at T1's weakness, you're typically looking at Owner, who has struggled for a lot of this year. I would say a good portion of this year, especially at being able to consistently generate advantages in the early game. It's typically his laners that are able to do that, and he's kind of more of a passenger. However, Lucid is just not the kind of guy who takes advantage of that super easily. He's played well in very specific circumstances. I think he's an interesting player, and I think he has played better in the playoffs than he did in the regular season. This was someone I criticized a lot in the regular season, but I don't think he's been that bad at all. In the playoffs, he was really good in that series against KT Rolster, and he was pretty good, I would say, generally against Gen.G. He clearly has Canyon's number. It's happened every single time they played against each other. However, this could be a series for Owner to get back on track. Lucid definitely struggles at being able to make the most out of his opportunities, and I think that Owner is pretty good at making the most out of his opportunities. If the laners are winning, then I don't think this jungle matchup is going to matter at all, and I think that's good for T1. And then Faker and Showmaker, come on, classic matchup. How can I even sit here and try and talk about which one of these should be better? They're both excellent. Showmaker is the life, heart, and soul of Dplus KIA at this point in their run, but Faker is still one of the best players in the entire league. He was the runner-up to my MVP, only behind Chovy, and he should be favored in this mid lane matchup, but again, Showmaker can win any matchup. We know he's talented enough to be able to take over any game in any circumstance. And then in the bot lane, you've got Guma and Keria taking on Aiming and Kellen. Now, this is more interesting because Aiming and Kellen were definitely the strength of DK in their series against Gen.G. Showmaker was great too, but Aiming, I thought, was the best player for DK in that series. There was a bit of a bot gap, at least a little bit, in terms of them versus Pays and Lehens, and Guma and Keria really got gapped by Hanwha Light. Viper and Delight made them look absolutely silly in the first series of their playoff run. However, would I expect those forms to translate, I guess, into a series like this? Would I expect Aiming and Kellen to continue to dominate Guma and Keria? No, I probably wouldn't. Guma and Keria are the better bot lane, and honestly, they should perform like the better bot lane. But if Aiming is in form, like, he's a very flippy player. When he's playing well, they do really, really well, and when he doesn't do well, then they do pretty poorly. And so if you're getting a good version of Aiming, this is going to be a lot closer of a bot lane matchup than maybe people are predicting. But, adding that essentially being a push, depending on which version of them shows up, everything else is in favor of T1, and I think that's why I feel so confident that T1 is going to be the better team here. I think they're going to get back on track. I would be very surprised if DK won this. My prediction is going to be T1 3-1 or T1 3-0. I think they are pretty clearly the favorites going into a series like this. I could see them dropping a game if Showmaker or Aiming or Lucid really pops off and has some fantastic performance, but for the most part, I would expect them to control the tempo, the momentum, and the confidence of this series, get their way back into the semifinals, and really have a shot to be able to get back into the finals, beating whoever they end up facing in the lower bracket. And so, yeah, I have T1 favored here, but if DK wins a game or two, I guess I wouldn't be entirely shocked. I just would be surprised if they won the whole series. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCK Round 2 overview and analysis video. We know our winners finals. We know the two teams that are down in lower bracket, at least to start off our playoff run here, and I'm very excited to see where they go. Let me know what you guys thought of everything down in the comments section below. Would love to know your thoughts on the games today, on what you expect from the games next weekend. I'm really interested to know what teams you're high or low on, what players you're high or low on, and who you expect to take that LCK trophy. Of course, if you did enjoy the video, please leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LCK. Of course, the LPL is also going on basically every single day, and so if you want to catch up on the LPL playoffs, of course, you can do that on this channel, and then the LEC playoffs are also going on. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, especially right here before MSI, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.